Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. On this episode, I sat down with Colleen Jarrett, Senior Counsel of Energy and Renewables at Clark Hill Law. Colleen is also a Senior Director of Strategy for the firm. Colleen really started to focus on CCUS and renewable projects in about 2020, so she has a great perspective on how the legal and regulatory landscape has developed for these kinds of projects, as well as how it's changed, especially in Louisiana, where she's been based for a lot of her career before recently moving back to DC. We covered a lot of different topics related to CCUS development, including some of the rulemaking coming down the pipeline for the CCUS industry in Louisiana, as well as some of the challenges exist around permitting and eminent domain. She also talked about how public perception has really influenced some of the state regulatory processes in Louisiana in recent years. To make sure you don't miss any new episodes, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Colleen. Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today I'm joined by Colleen Jarrett. Colleen, how are you?
Doing great, Deb. How are you?
Good. It's so fun to reconnect and to see you. We were just chatting about, we've known each other a long time and
Yes.
reconnected recently. You're senior counsel at a firm called Clark Hill. And so I'm super excited to dive into regulation and litigation conversation, which seems like such a strange thing. But but tell
Especially
us,
for the two of us,
I
right?
know. But tell us a little bit about what Clark Hill does and your position there in the sort of decarbonization space.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to. So I recently just relocated from New Orleans back to Washington, D.C. And being here at Clark Hill, they've got a very large office here in D.C. focusing on environmental, energy, and natural resources. And so I'm a part of that group. We are actually an international law firm.
Well,
We have 30 offices, including one in Mexico City, and we've got one in Dublin, Ireland as well, the mother country, right? So it's really exciting, but our footprint is quite national. I mean, it's very broad. We've got offices on all coasts, and so it's been really exciting to be a part of not only the EENR practice group, but I also straddle Clark Hill Public Strategies, which is more of a advocacy on sort of the lobbying side of things here in Washington, D.C., but really all over the country. We've got clients that are up in Michigan. We've got clients that are here in DC. We've got folks that are in, Louisiana and other places. So it's quite lovely to be a part of such a national platform and being able to use that on behalf of clients and in advocating for their issues in addition to helping them solve problems.
yeah. No, I love that. And I think the piece around like the federal and the state, and we'll dive into that a little bit, but like I'm curious on the sort of lobbying side because you sit on the sort of more environmental side of it. I assume some of that lobbying and policy
Energy side,
effort.
I would say.
Okay,
Energy,
so
yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
so like, how does like, for folks that aren't familiar with kind of like what that looks like and stuff, like how I'm curious how, you must be working with lots of different clients all over the country across all forms of
Yes.
energy and decarbonization and stuff like that. So just for folks that aren't familiar with like sort of what that effort would look like, and as you're thinking about policy, like, yeah, I would love a little bit of overview about that as well.
Yeah, so for my practice, really my concentration, I would say over the last 6 years has been more on the carbon capture and
Mm,
sequestration side of the kind of oil and gas fence, if you will, right? So there's traditional E&P oil and gas that I have done for many years, defending oil and gas companies, whether they're majors, super majors, or independent operators. Really on I guess in that respect, kind of on the environmental side, right? Because it was
mm,
defending them in legacy lawsuits, which are something it's a kind of lawsuit that's I would say unique to Louisiana. These are cases where landowners that have historical oil and gas operations on their property sue everyone in the mineral title chain, claiming, soil contamination, groundwater contamination. Some of those cases, for the most part, those cases settle. and really, don't go to trial that often. But there have been some cases that have made it to trial recently, and there have been some big verdicts. One of which was recently just overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that was somewhat of a big victory for the oil and gas industry, and it was great to see. But really, that was kind of most of my practice for about 15 years, and then started getting into carbon capture during COVID.
Mm,
And trying to figure out, everyone was pivoting at that point in time, right? That was always the big word, pivoting.
yep.
And so really started to look at where, oil and gas was kind of going. Where was the industry going? Where was this energy transition taking us? And so really started looking at carbon capture with kind of a critical lens then, and got into it in 2020, and had clients already reaching out saying, hey, we're seeing that this is taking off, right? Like in Louisiana, we had laws on the books since 2009
Oh, wow.
relating to carbon capture and actually promoting carbon capture, but nobody really did anything about it until 2020. And then we started seeing some legislation creep in at the during the legislative process and during the 2020 session. And so people started looking at it again and saying, oh, this is really interesting. Let's see where this is going to go. And then, of course, there was the support through the Biden administration, and even now through the Trump administration, through the 45Q tax credits, to really kind of have this, way of monetizing these projects to make them be something that are, attractive to oil and gas
Yeah.
companies, to folks that would have the money to invest in this side of decarbonization. And so really kind of started getting into it in that way. And then from there, it took off.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of progress happening in the 2021, 2022, even 2023 session. And then in 2024, we started to see a little bit of a shift, right? It started to go from being more operator friendly to being something that was a little bit more landowner friendly.
Okay.
And then this session, you know, it has not yet ended, but from all accounts, there really hasn't been a lot of work done on the CCS side. There were 40 bills that were proposed for this
40.
session. 40, yes. Including what some are calling kind of the landowner bill of rights, right? The
Okay.
landowner protection act. But even that was kind of put off to the side.
Okay.
And so we really have not seen a lot of debate about it. I think maybe the strategy this year is that folks are going to be focusing more on doing some sort of study and seeing
Mm,
how these carbon, capture projects is also going, how they're going to intersect with mineral rights,
yeah.
and where is all that going to go. So that really seems to be the only piece of legislation that has kind of passed this session. So it's been very interesting to see. There's been a
Yeah.
lot of activity recently, and then we get to this session, and even though there were a ton of bills that were filed, a lot of them were just defeated or otherwise kind of ignored.
Yeah. Okay. And we're going to dive into some of this stuff in a little
Yeah.
bit more detail. But before we do, I'm really fascinated to learn, for me, and again, as a non lawyer, so tell me where I'm wrong about some of these things and stuff. Like, for me, it's always around how companies are thinking about risk and, where are they
Yes.
making sure that, things aren't going to go wrong. And if they do, they're minimizing their risk.
Yeah.
So, as we think about, carbon capture in particular, but sort of just the changing energy landscape broadly. How have you seen that kind of landscape? You've sort of touched on a few things, but I'm fascinated. I've done some regulatory work and litigation for traditional oil and gas stuff as an engineer and expert witness. But the idea of
Hmm.
the risks associated with, these I say emerging markets, right? I'm just so fascinated kind of with your take as you've seen, you've been doing this for 6 years now of how it's sort of shifted a little bit and how are companies really sort of looking at what that liability is going to look like and how you guys are sort of going about
Hmm.
some of this work? I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so that part of it has been very interesting in
Mm,
terms of how it has evolved over the last 6 years. So initially, sort of the I would say out of the gate kind of concern was, can we get enough pore space
mm,
acquired, right, for these projects? And so of course there's a lot of liability there as it relates to what kinds of provisions are you putting into these lease contracts in order to get the pore space? How is that going to work out with the landowners? What's going to happen if there happens to be some sort of subsurface migration of the carbon dioxide? What's going to happen in the event that not only is there a subsurface migration, but also what if there is some sort of, subsurface, I would say disruption, if you
Mm.
will, I mean, some sort of like seismic
Yeah, an
change, some
earthquake or
sort
something.
of,
Yeah.
will it come back up through the surface? I mean, there's always supposed to be some cap rock there to kind of cover and make sure that the subsurface stays where it's supposed to be. But what if there is some sort of, volatile formation and it winds up coming back up through the cap rock? So that's always been a concern as well. But then also, where does that intersection between doing these types of projects and the mineral rights that already exist there, right? So
Yeah.
you've got oil and gas lessees that are already, doing, I would say, exploration and production activities, right, from formations that may be below where this carbon dioxide is going to reside, or maybe above where the carbon dioxide is going to be. And so that's always presented a very interesting question, and one that I think is probably going to be coming to a head here quite soon, as there have been, a number of mineral servitude owners that have been having some issues with some of these projects that have been developing in kind of the northern part of Louisiana, and there have been some lawsuits filed there. So, it's very interesting to see where all this is going to ultimately get to. I think, unfortunately, this technology is still not completely scalable, and so once you get beyond the question of pore space acquisition and do we have enough pore space to take on, the customers that we plan to in order to take that carbon dioxide away from them and put it into the ground, then you've got other questions about, okay, well, what's going to happen then if the technology isn't there when we need it, right?
Yeah.
What if we don't have the investors behind us in order to really put the money into these projects that we need to in order to have them grow and flourish like we expect that they would?
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of liability and a lot of concern around that as well.
That makes sense. And I've got one more kind of high level question, and um, the risk of reversal piece is real. Like, and to be honest, a lot of the conversation I've had around that has been with like project developers around this question of permanence when people are generating carbon credits, or if they're in, say, California and they're like dealing with the cap and invest system out there in terms of, who's liable in terms of like price and payment and stuff like that. Is that something that you guys are starting to think about at all, or is that coming up as part of the conversations, or are you guys more focused on the physical risk and like stuff staying in the ground? I don't know. The permanence conversation is just this ongoing debate that is an
Yeah.
interesting one to me.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have somewhat of a 360-degree view of these projects,
Mm,
right? So definitely on the physical side of things, but then also when you're talking about kind of putting together the cap stack
mm,
for these projects, right? These aren't projects that are all, capex from, say, a major oil and gas company. These cap stacks involve, Department of Energy grants. They involve private investors. They involve, people who are actually going to be involved with the offtake process and things like that. The
yeah,
midstream market, right? So we saw that Exxon purchased all of Denbury's pipeline assets, and
yep,
so now Exxon is in charge of those. So we're seeing a lot of movement in that regard. But I think that when you're talking about the cap stack and how that money is actually going to be flowing into these projects, I think it's definitely, more of a fulsome kind of view when we're talking about that versus there just being one source versus another.
yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's the oil and gas regulation litigation piece has been an ongoing piece. Like I said, I've done quite a bit of that, but it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. So we're going to dive into some of the like particular topics that you've sort of kind of already kind of talked through and talked about and stuff. But we're going to start with sort of regulatory and permitting piece. I feel like everyone I talk to in any state right now is just permitting reform is like the number one thing that everyone is talking about. So talk about like what does permitting reform mean as it relates to CCUS or CCS projects specifically? And then I'm sort of curious what you're also seeing around the challenges in that area for these projects as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so in Louisiana, and of course, my focus is really kind of in Louisiana because
Yep.
I was there for 21 years, and so have sort of watched this kind of happen in a very sort of holistic way, organic way from the time that the legislation was really originally filed until today, and more recently, what we're seeing is there's a lot of reorganization that is happening in the state of Louisiana. In particular, you know, Governor Landry recently put a pause in place on any new carbon capture applications, and so that has created somewhat of a ripple effect
Mm,
on how these projects are actually being built out. Right, there were a number of applications that were already on file with the Department of Conservation and Energy before this moratorium went into place, and so those applications are sort of getting the priority right
okay.
now. But what we're seeing is that with the huge reorganization that happened at the Department of Conservation and Energy, which is the entity that's basically they've been tapped by the ETA to have the regulatory power to not only allow the permitting to go through, but to also be in charge of all the other regulations that govern these carbon capture
Mm,
projects. And so they went through a huge reorganization as of October 1 of last year. And so I think we're now seeing them kind of come out the other side of this. And obviously the permitting landscape has changed quite significantly, especially with respect to these class six
yeah.
applications because of the pause. That pause was supposed to only be in place for about 45 days.
Oh,
So
wow.
everybody was sort of expecting that the pause was going to end back in December of last year, but
Yeah.
that didn't happen. It is still ongoing today, and here we are. It's May of
Yep.
2026. So as you can imagine, that's having somewhat of a negative effect on folks that are trying to figure out what to do next with these projects. Right? Do we
Yeah.
move forward? Do we sit here and kind of reassess and figure out whether or not we want to put our money into carbon capture projects? We want to put our money maybe into hydrogen instead and try to really capitalize on these 45V credits. And so there have been a lot of changes that have happened recently as a result of that. The Department of Conservation and Energy went from having its own sort of, commission and a commissioner within the department to now just having sort of six different areas where
Oh,
these
wow.
projects are kind of being governed and where that new regulatory scheme is kind of coming from. So there have definitely been a lot of changes there. And then, of course, through the legislative process, we've seen a lot of changes as it relates to eminent domain, unitization capabilities for these types of projects. So that's where a lot of regulation is starting to change. When unitization kind of came into place I think it was during the 2024 session that unitization first came about for carbon capture projects. Initially, you only needed 75% of the landowners to consent to leasing pore space or moving forward with these projects. Now that has been raised to 85%. So it's quite a bit of a difference, from where the legislation and sort of the regulatory scheme began to versus where it is
Yeah.
now. And I think that change is significant. I think
Yeah.
you're also seeing that with regard to pipelines
Well,
using
that's
eminent domain.
before you jump in on the pipeline piece, I wanna dive in on the unitization piece a little bit more. Sorry, I didn't wanna but,
That's
like,
okay.
I'm fascinated with that. So just for folks that aren't familiar with what when you were talking about unitization and what that means, it's essentially and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but, like, we're taking, like, large tracts of land that maybe have some different owners and different mineral interest owners and stuff like that, and creating a unit that's a certain size so that it can be developed as a whole project. And that's
Correct.
very like is the 85%, and essentially that's saying you need 85% of all the owners, and again, for folks that aren't familiar with this, some of the mineral interest owners hold tiny, tiny portions of these lands and fractions of
Fractional
percents.
interest.
So
Yes.
finding all of these people can be really challenging. There's
Yes.
estates, there's all sorts of stuff that move and things like that. And it's not to say we shouldn't reach out and try, but to get to 85% is a huge piece. I'm
That's right.
curious, is that consistent with the unitization rules in the state for oil and gas, or is the CCUS stuff being dealt with differently? Like,
It's being dealt with a little bit
oh,
differently.
that's
So
interesting.
initially, when the unitization rules were being formulated, and I was part of a committee that was helping to do this and to get some legislation together for the upcoming session. The thought process was, let's basically model these on the oil and
Yeah.
gas unitization rules. But obviously now, carbon capture has kind of taken on its own life, and so it's gone a little bit above and beyond those requirements that are needed for oil and gas.
Oh,
So
wow.
the 85% is specific to carbon capture and
Oh, wow.
sequestration.
It'll be interesting
Yeah.
to see how that plays out. So
Yes.
then, yeah. So then, thinking about then pipelines and like the piece there. So let's jump into that bit and what you were going to do there. But I was just, yeah, the unitization piece was fast. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so initially on the eminent domain side,
Yeah.
operators were given the opportunity to use eminent domain as a way of laying some new pipe for these projects. Because a lot of the pipelines that are in Louisiana, we have a huge web of pipelines throughout the state, which is really great for these projects. And I think one of the things that makes a Louisiana so attractive for these projects, but what we're learning is that a lot of those pipelines would need to be retrofitted in order to
Um,
allow carbon dioxide to flow through them, right? To make sure that there isn't any sort of corrosion issue and to make sure that the pipe can actually withstand, the supercritical material, the carbon dioxide that's going to be flowing through them. And so a lot of the pipelines would actually need to be new,
wow.
if companies were not interested in going through the retrofitting process. And so we were allowed to use eminent domain as a way of laying that new pipe. In the most recent legislation that was passed in 2025, we saw that there was again a little bit of a change there, something that was going to require operators to do a little bit more in terms of actually using eminent domain. And that was they had to prove that the pipeline would be a common carrier and that the pipeline would be for a public use and not just for a specific project. And so I think the purpose there was really to kind of create this heightened level, in order to actually obtain a certificate of public use from the Department of Conservation and Energy. So it wasn't enough to just say, look, we're doing this carbon dioxide, capture project, and we're trying to make sure that we've got the pipeline that we need to get it from the emitter that is maybe in the northwestern part of the state down to where the pore space actually is in the southeastern part of the state. We need to make sure that we're able to do that. And initially they said, okay, great, we can go ahead and use eminent domain for that purpose, but now we've got to actually go ahead and prove this extra layer that it's going to be used for a public purpose and that it's going to be a common carrier pipeline. Now, the biggest issue with all of this is the fact that that standard was not actually set forth in the legislation itself. So nobody really knows
God.
what that means to be a
Yeah.
common carrier in this
That was
context,
that was gonna be my
right?
first question, like, what does that even
Yes,
mean? And how do you
correct.
demonstrate public good for a pipeline? Uh,
Exactly.
like yeah,
Exactly. With that, obviously this is going to be a question that's going to have to be interpreted by the courts. And so we'll see where that actually goes, and what that will look like in the coming years. But right now, the way the legislation is drafted is it's got to be a common carrier. But again, without any sort of definition, without any, citation to another statute or something like that to use the definition there.
yeah.
And so now everyone's kind of left just almost proving a negative, right? Because you have to meet some standard, but you don't really know what that standard is. So
That's
that's
really
definitely
challenging.
presenting a challenge for operators.
Yeah. So the other pipeline question I was thinking about as well, like you talked about how, Louisiana and Texas, given all the sort of industrial areas along the Gulf Coast and stuff like that, they are really, prime areas for this kind of development. How does then pipelines go cross state. Like, how does this then work with, say, Texas, or is that regulated federally? And do they have similar rules? And like, how does like that would add an extra layer of complexity in there? I assume. Like,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, not only would you have to get the consent of the landowners kind of that traverse that entire path from Texas to Louisiana, but yeah, I imagine FERC would be involved in there
Mm,
somewhere as well, right? You
wow.
would have to get some sort of FERC approval. I did work on briefly on an international project where we were talking about taking a pipeline from Mexico City and potentially maybe using some pore space in Louisiana for that carbon dioxide. And that was basically the process that we had to go through. I mean,
Wow.
obviously there were international laws and
Yep.
regulations that we had to worry about as well, and worrying about, getting federal support for that. But yeah, most definitely you would need to have the landowner's approval for that entire stretch of property.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy. So you've talked about pore space a lot, and so I want to pivot to kind of that topic and what's kind of going on in the legislature and the regulations around pore space for CCUS. Because, I'm just curious. I'm very curious how it like differs from what we're doing in oil and gas. Like some of the challenges that are popping up. You sort of talked about at the top how we're starting to see like different like mineral owners almost with like oil and gas versus others. I don't know. I'm just really curious about what's how does that get defined in Louisiana? And what's kind of seeing in that space?
Yeah, so pore space, I mean, if we want to talk about, what the physical pore space is going to look like, you can always sort of thinking about a glass jar that has some marbles in it, right? And so the pore space that we're talking about with respect to carbon capture is really those nooks and crannies in between the marbles, and that's where the carbon dioxide really would reside. And as you mentioned before, in perpetuity, right? So we're expecting that once the supercritical material is taken from the emitter's facility, transported by pipeline, and then put into this pore space, that the pore space would actually hold the carbon dioxide forever. And hopefully there wouldn't be any migration.
Yep.
Obviously that's one of the things that you have to prove in your application process, and what you have to show the Department of Conservation and Energy through computer modeling is that the pore space is actually going to hold that carbon dioxide in situ for forever. It's never going to go anywhere. It will be permanently placed there, and not to be used again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and does it like in terms of like leasing and for project developers and stuff like that, does it follow a similar kind of path with oil and gas, like mineral leasing and some of that kind of stuff in terms of subsurface rights?
Yes, absolutely. It definitely does. I would say with these projects, there is definitely, what we're seeing in the leasing process is there is going to be some sort of investigation or exploratory period. Sometimes they put these in the form of an option.
Okay.
And so you have a couple of years to sort of go through this exploratory process to determine that the pore space can actually hold all of the carbon dioxide that
Yep.
your landmen and geologists have said that it can hold. And then from there you move into the actual lease terms, and those
Okay.
vary, right? It's not as simple as the primary term that you might get with an oil and gas lease. These have sort of been all over the map in terms of
Wow.
actual periods of time that it will cover. I've seen some that are 2 to 3 years. I've seen some that are 10. I've seen some that are 20. It really just depends on the operator and how much risk they're willing to take on for a specific period of time in terms of determining the length of what that lease period might be.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So jumping topics again, you talked a little bit about the legislative session and just how many like bills and stuff have been put forward. I know when you and I were talking about this before we jumped on, you talked about the fact that there'd been a lot of anti-CCS bills filed and stuff. So I'm
Yes.
curious why and by who and like what does that mean? Like I'm curious about that. Like
Well, so it's been interesting to watch all of this progress. I mean, there was a lot of support and excitement around carbon capture, in 2020, 2021.
yeah.
And then around 2022, as Louisiana was kind of getting closer to actually obtaining primacy from the EPA, we started to see more and more environmental groups kind of coming out strong against carbon capture.
Huh.
There was a project that was moving forward in Lake Maurepas that was being built out by Air Products, and when that happened, we were seeing people kind of like coming out of the woodwork
Wow.
in to basically fight against this project from moving forward. And you were seeing, residents in the parish of Livingston that were coming out against it. You were seeing national environmental organizations that were coming out against it, local organizations. On the national side, I would say the Bucket Brigade. They were coming out and saying that carbon capture, is the next sort of peril to the environment. And they were also, screaming that there wasn't enough environmental justice being done to make sure that certain pockets of Louisiana weren't being impacted from a socioeconomic basis from these projects, those sorts of
Huh.
things. And I think folks, unfortunately, are getting a lot of their information from social media. They're not really looking into the science and the facts that really support these projects going forward. I mean, in Louisiana, we've been doing carbon capture by way of enhanced oil recovery projects, for the last 30, 40 years. And a lot of that has been happening up in the Haynesville Shale area, but it's all been done without incident. There hasn't been any sort of
Yeah.
impact to human health. There hasn't been any impact to the environment. Every time they try to bring up some sort of, story about, oh, it's doing all these horrible things to the environment, that always pans out to not be true. And the same with these permanent sequestration projects. It's going to be the same way. I mean, all of this is under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So when we're talking about trying to be protective of not only human capital but also environmental capital, all of that is going to be evaluated to the highest standard, because the whole point of these projects is to not interfere with or contaminate any sort of sources of drinking water.
Yeah.
And so, that is really the standard that Louisiana has used. That is also the federal standard. I would say Louisiana has even gone beyond that in terms of being protective of, liability as it relates to these projects, and making sure that operators are staying on the hook for these projects, 50 years after the last injection of carbon dioxide. So, I think that the fact that communities are now coming out and saying, oh, these projects are awful, a lot of it just seems to be a little hyperbolic, because they don't seem to have really any facts that are backing that up, right?
Hmm.
It's just, we're angry and we think that these projects are bad, but there isn't really any sort of fact-based reason to be anti CCS.
Yeah.
And I think that perhaps the industry could do a better job of promoting how safe these projects are. I mean, obviously, when you've got companies like Chevron and Exxon and Shell that are engaging in these projects, they're going to make sure they are the safest projects
Yeah.
possible. They are very onerous in their own regard in making sure that any project that they become involved with is safe.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's always a very high priority for them. It's something that is always top of mind in any project that they work on. And so I think that really community stakeholders and I think the oil and gas industry really need to come together a little bit more and have really an open dialogue about what these projects are, what the safety requirements are. Are they actually safe? Yes. I just feel like there has not been enough of that real kind of one-on-one discussion about these projects. We see with some of the permits that are being granted for CCS projects in Louisiana. Of course, you've got to go through the public hearing
Yep.
process before any permit is issued, as you well know. And we see, fights are happening,
Wow.
at these parish town halls where they're talking about these projects and where they're, vetting these projects and making sure that they are actually safe. And so, they have to hire police to come in as security
Wow.
in these smaller towns where these hearings are occurring. And it's unfortunate. I think that there is a productive way to go about this discussion and making sure that both sides see the risks and the benefits that can come from these projects.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack in there, but it's something that, I've been kind of diving into and stuff more and more because there's a couple of pieces there around like perceptions of both climate
Hmm.
and energy development and stuff. Like for people that aren't in the space, and it's not necessarily because people aren't smart and things like that, but nobody has time to read nobody has time to read
Right.
anything but headlines or what pops up on their social media feed and things like that. Like so it's, the perceptions of climate and energy and some of that kind of stuff just get in my mind, and it's something I'm starting to dive into, get really blown out of proportion. But I wonder if there's an element of it as well. And again, who knows? But there's also seems to be a very like climate people are anti-energy, and energy people are anti like climate people, and like there's just
Anti-fossil
this
fuel for sure.
like,
Yes.
there's just a bit of a tension there where, like, the
Yeah.
groups of like, to your point, like, the communication has completely broken down between the
Yes.
sort of industry and climate people, and it's gonna take a lot to repair some of those relationships so that we can
Yeah.
actually get everybody to the same table. But to your point, like, it's worth doing, and it's, like,
Absolutely.
as we try and understand, how do we reduce, the emissions and think about that and what that looks like. You know, you would think that some of this and the fact that EU, we talked about enhanced oil recovery, like that is not classified for
Right.
any funding and all this kind of stuff because it does,
Right.
we're talking about permanent storage of CO2. It's a very different, it's not a different process, but it's a very different kind of proposition when we're talking about long-term impacts in terms of carbon removal and stuff. So yeah, we've forgotten how to talk to each other, unfortunately. Like,
I I agree, and unfortunately, we can only talk in, like, short TikTok videos, right?
yeah,
Or through Slack or something like that. I mean,
yeah,
it's not very, productive, or it does not actually serve either side's interests
no,
when we're not able to actually come to the table and look at each other across the table and have a discussion about where these projects are going and what impact, if any, they might
yeah,
have on a particular neighborhood or parish. One of the things that I thought was very smart, that came out of the 2024 legislative session was Senator Heather Cloud put together a task force to investigate any sort of impact, whether to the environment, to the industry, to people, as it relates to these carbon capture projects. And that was probably the one time there was somewhat of a
mm,
healthy discussion about what these impacts might be. And she invited folks from industry, from environmental, organizations, from the bureaucratic side of things, right? Getting the
yeah,
regulators from Baton Rouge to come in and provide some testimony from trade associations. And so it was like that one time where people were actually coming in and being able to have somewhat of a discussion and really kind of move the meter, if you will, as it relates to these carbon dioxide
yeah.
projects.
Um,
Yeah.
we just need to your point, we just need to see more of it. 2024 was so long ago
Yes.
now, like,
I
which
know,
is
right?
crazy.
Exactly. It really
Um,
was.
yeah. So, Colleen, this has been awesome. Like, I'm curious, like, both from you working in Louisiana and living in DC now and stuff, like, what's on your radar? Like, what are you looking out for in terms of either different, like, things coming out of the legislature or out of the federal government? Like, yeah, what's on
Data
Colleen's radar?
centers.
Data centers. Okay. Along with it, you and
Data
everyone else.
centers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I know.
and
I
why?
mean, it
Why?
really has been sort of the I would say the issue du jour.
Yeah.
I think mainly because it touches so many different industries.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It's not just about AI, but it's also about power and having reliable power. It's also about, potentially doing carbon management through these projects as well, right? Maybe having a CCS component or having a hydrogen component. It's also, obviously touching the construction industry. So I think that, these data centers and there's such fervor right now with moving forward with these data centers and making sure that they're being stood up up, in the next 2 years or less.
Yep.
And so I think that there's a lot of attention that is happening right now. I mean, pretty much every morning I get the E&E roundup in my inbox. I get JD Supra in my inbox. And a lot of them are breaking these projects down by region.
Mm.
And what we're seeing is that, this really is, if it's done in the right way, this really could be a boon for many industries. And I think that there are obviously, with projects like this, there's always risk. And I think we're now just starting to figure out what that level of risk is. I think a lot of that is really around this question of power and where is it going to come from? Is it sustainable? Will it be reliable for the life of the data center?
Yeah.
Will it be enough for the data center? And so I think that these data centers that we're starting to see, I think that's really going to be sort of the focus for the next couple of years.
Yeah. Love it. Well, Colleen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. As always, it's great to catch up and chat and
It's
stuff. So
wonderful
thank
to
you.
catch up with you, Deb. Thank you so much for this invitation. I've loved our discussion. If you need anything else offline, please let me know.
Love it. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Take care.